So our idea worth spreading is the imagination age, but I have to give credit to the source of the idea, which is a little girl many years ago who told me that I was the only adult she knew who made her feel like her imagination didn't have to die when she grew up. So at that point, I decided I would dedicate myself to creating a future in any way I could contribute to that future in which children's imaginations do not have to die when they grow up, because I think imagination is the most important thing that leads us to new discoveries. So this quote, "The creative adult is the child who has survived." I'm just doing my part to try and make sure that as many of us can think as freely as we can and collaborate on ideas that will help save us and make the world better. So after I spoke to her, I realized that as a child, when I was her age, I also had a day that made me realize what my future was going to look like. My father is a disabled Vietnam vet, and he went back to school when I was growing up, and he was studying at Columbia University. And he let me skip school and go with him one day, and it was the most pivotal day of my life, so I do recommend that kids be allowed to skip school once in a while. First, we went to see a French film, and it was a black and white film with subtitles, and it pretty much blew my mind because it was the first time I'd ever seen a film that wasn't in English. And then he took me out to lunch and taught me how to eat with chopsticks. And then that afternoon, he took me to his physics class. And in his class, I learned about quarks, which pretty much did me in for the rest of my life. So that day I realized that art, science, and culture, that to me, it just imprinted on me as the most important things. And when this child mentioned imagination to me, at that time I had been working as an investigative reporter. I started off at the community level as a reporter, learning about how municipalities worked, attending many grueling town board meetings, school board meetings, zoning board meetings, planning board meetings, in many different types of environments, urban and rural, and everything in between. And so I started to learn how communities worked. At the same time, for about a decade, I accidentally started a business writing intimate stories about people's lives for private use in families, so the family members could understand each other on a deeper level. And some of these were book-length essays, some of these, book-length manuscripts, some of them were essays, some of them were letters. But I started to see overlaps between the way communities worked and the way people's private lives worked. Gradually my beat started to widen. I became an investigative reporter on the nuclear industry and also the relationship between corporations and the government and the digital culture. So as this work began to unfold, I realized I was sort of training for something that I didn't know what it was until I met James Jorash, who is the founder of Science House. He's a master inventor, entrepreneur, memory champion, chess champion. They invited me to come and give a talk on creativity, and I never left. And I've also been collaborating for 5 years with Joshua Fouts. So this is what Josh looked like when I met him. That's me. Higher cheekbones, hair never gets frizzy in a virtual world. At the time, Josh was directing a think tank at the University of Southern California, the Center on Public Diplomacy. And so as the imagination age started to take shape, this was about 5 or 6 years ago, I realized that we needed to focus on a specific mission, which is cultural and economic development happening in tandem. Because I had been reporting on the relationship between corporations and the government, it didn't take much to make a leap that we were going to have a serious economic calamity in the near future. Obviously, I couldn't have predicted the shape that would take, but it seemed inevitable. So about 6 years ago, we started working on ways that we could undermine that collapse for the next generation by helping to provide them with the sort of tools they needed to be employed in an uncertain future, punctuated by rapid technological shifts. So I was told repeatedly that there was a person named Schmilson Nilsson in Second Life that I had to meet, and so for months in this format we started collaborating. And it was around that time that I started working with IBM. In fact, Jack Mason, who just spoke, was one of the first people I met. He's an absolute visionary when it comes to hybrid environments and understanding the business value of those. And so the imagination age really doesn't look, we're platform agnostic, we're technology agnostic. It's more of a mindset. So we don't make any distinction between virtual and physical, hybrid, augmented, how anything is used separately. We look at the mindset that's necessary to cope with rapid change in a fast-changing environment, and how we can employ the next generation. And so Josh and I worked on many different projects in about a dozen countries in 4 continents, and we started to see how different global labor markets fit together, how technology fit into those global labor markets, and how cultures could really start to work together to erode geopolitical and socioeconomic boundaries and start to understand things like, how does virtual currency work? What are the emerging characteristics of the global labor market? And so after we did this 5-year international research period, which was funded by very diverse sources of think tanks, universities, public companies, private companies, we had created this theoretical framework, and we decided to look back at the US, and we spent 2 years working on a project called Imagination, Creating the Future of Education and Work. And we looked at the way the education system in the US is falling apart. Rather than writing a book about something completely depressing that nobody could do anything about, we decided instead to create an interactive project, this is the homepage for the project, where educators, parents, kids, anyone could click on any one of these chapters and get advice for implementing aspects of this mindset that we're talking about into the classroom for free, immediately, with really no strain on the educators. And so we also have today with us Bob Lindbergh, who's the founding director of the National Institute of Aerospace, and he is one of the chapters. 17 is on STEM education, for example. We all hear about STEM education all the time, but none of us learned anything about engineering in school, and kids are still not learning anything about engineering in school. And so Bob is one of the educators that we interviewed for the project, and he gives a black boxes talk about the difference between the scientific method and the design process that engineers use. And the moment in his talk that I really love the most is when he talks about science being everything in the natural world and the process of inquiry into that, and then engineering being everything else, so everything we create, the systems that we create. And he looks over at a tree that's next to the podium, and he's going to use it as an example, I don't know, either of science or of engineering, and he realizes that it is a plastic tree. And that pretty much summarizes the times that we live in right now. I mean, everything's a little bit hybrid right now, and so I think it's helpful to take a step back and not make a distinction between the two, aside from learning how to look into them. So the Imagination Project, I'll turn this over to my collaborator, Josh Fouts, but I just wanted to say that we started off in the Cajun region of Louisiana at a $27 million facility that is a complete anomaly in the landscape, this glowing egg that here you see it in the day, but at night it's absolutely spectacular. Where we spent the week with a group of students who had never learned to collaborate before, because kids only collaborate on sports in the US. They don't collaborate on learning, and they don't collaborate on tackling serious issues together, which is to the great detriment of the US. So I will turn it over to Joshua at this point and let him tell you about the project.
So as we landed in Lafayette in 2009, we parachuted into what was called Game Camp. It was a group, it was a 1-week retreat for students who were really interested in understanding what games were about. But the tasks that they were given were to actually build games that were around very, very serious issues. And in Louisiana, the kids there are very aware of the fact that their state ranks the lowest in almost all of the metrics by which you measure success in the United States today. They have the highest rate of obesity, they have the highest rate of poverty, they have the highest rate of unemployment. The environmental conditions have been suffering dramatically. So these kids, while passionate and interested in games, took very, very seriously the assignments they got, which were to build games about reducing obesity in Louisiana, about how to improve the environment. One of the things that we took away from that, and I'll tell you a little bit about what we saw in the results, was different ways that both teachers and students need to be empowered to really transform the educational and truly the economic system that we're living in today. The systems, the restrictions of those systems that we have, particularly when it comes to educating our K through 12 students, are not in step with where our planet is going. For example, much of the way teachers today are assigned to teach students is to maintain students working individually. That is to say, the standardized test. Collaboration is considered an anathema in education, whereas collaboration is what's needed today. So I'm going to unpack some of our takeaways. One of the key takeaways that we had is that it's important to empower identity and authenticity and play in education. And by that we mean that play is often referred to or is viewed through the media as something that is not productive, when in fact play is one of the most powerful ways of creating and enabling creativity and productivity. So one of the games that was built by the students in Louisiana was a game called Whack-A-Mole. And just by way of background, just to intimidate the students a little bit more, they were told that a bunch of game designers from Austin, Texas were going to be flown in at the end of their week. And the game designers were assigned to grill them just as they would any person pitching a game idea to them. So they were supposed to teach or treat 13 and 14-year-olds like they would 30 and 40-year-olds who were veterans in pitching game ideas. So just to keep the intimidation factor higher, when when these game developers arrived from Austin, Texas, flown in, they were all dressed in black with aviator glasses, and the 14-year-old kids stood up and presented the games that they had designed to address issues like, as I mentioned, environmental conditions, weight loss, obesity, what have you. One of the students presented a game that was about the coastal wetlands, and the game that they had designed was a game called Whack-A-Nutria. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Gulf Coast, a prolific rodent in that region is known as the nutria. It's large, it swims in the water, looks like a big rat. As the kid presented his game idea, one of the developers from Austin challenged him and said, how do you know that the Whack-A-Mole people aren't going to sue you for copyright infringement? Now, these kids had never had any experience public speaking before. In fact, when they were assigned to the game camp week that they spent, they'd had no experience really working in collaborative groups. So they were asked to spontaneously decide who was going to be the art director, who was going to be the producer, who was going to be the designer, who was going to be the director, and they really came together and collaborated powerfully in this way. So as they were asked this very tense question, a little 14-year-old boy named Charlie straightened up his tie and proceeded to very lucidly list a 6-point example of why he knew that his Whack-A-Nutria game was not in conflict with the Whack-A-Mole copyright suit. Right there, it was sort of an epiphanic moment for us, where we realized that when you empower kids and you treat them like adults, and you give them the responsibility to take ownership for these things that they're creating, you really actually get to see them blossom and grow in a way that we didn't actually, that our system hasn't been empowering them to do. And so really what this report was trying to do was to get teachers and parents and students to realize that the system needs to empower them with greater responsibility than we have to this day. And part of that, I think, is going to be fundamental in terms of the transformation of our global economy. That's part of what makes having joined Science House Foundation so exciting for me, because what Science House Foundation is doing is basically empowering kids around the world to collaborate globally toward careers in science and mathematics. What's really interesting about that is that the vision that James Jorash laid out for that is that one of the projects, for example, is called Microglobalscope. And what Microglobalscope does is we give high-powered microscopes to 5th and 6th graders in cities around the world. Why 5th and 6th graders? 5th and 6th graders are just at that age where they're not yet get fully immersed, if you will, in the dynamics of social and peer pressure, and you might be able to engage 5th and 6th graders and empower them actually to pursue careers that are authentic to them. Authentic meaning science, meaning mathematics. But here's the sweet spot in this idea. So while we have grantees in Brazil and in Serbia and in Thailand and throughout the United States and Canada, all of the students, teachers, upload the students' discoveries to a shared website that we have a picture of above us here. That shared website allows the students to see that science is inherently collaborative. Science is not isolated. And science, if you think about science, of all the fields that are important in our economy today, that's one of the few fields that is inherently apolitical. Look at the Large Hadron Collider, for example, which was the product of over 100 different scientists from over 100 different countries around the world. It's also, getting back to Rita's point of the imagination age, a source of great imagination. A couple of months ago, we went to the World Science Festival here in New York City. I don't know how many of you went to it, and we saw a panel of physicists. In fact, what happened to be the Nobel Prize winning, 2011 Nobel Prize winning physicist Saul Perlmutter. And Saul Perlmutter's, what Saul Perlmutter did was he determined that our universe was not expanding at the same rate that Einsteinian theory would dictate. And when this panel of illustrious physicists were asked what it is that they would imagine would explain this, they said, well, it's obvious. We're living in a parallel universe. We're living simply in a hologram that other universes actually adhere to these rules. But what really stuck with me was the point that here we have trained mathematicians and scientists who are actually using their imagination to think radically different ideas. And these are the kind of same ideas that we're hoping to transfer onto the students and the grantees that we're giving through the Science House Foundation. And I think that synergy between science and imagination really helps to characterize and define this great philosophy that Rita has created called the Imagination Age. Thank you all so much.